If you talk to any government leader, they will tell you that they want their nation to be prosperous. and that they want to improve the quality of life for their people. Yet, very few third world nations rise up out of their economic slum. Many of these nations are rich in natural resources, but poverty is still rampant throughout these nations. Poor management of resources, with their national leaders driven by greed and obsession to keep power, that has set the pattern for systemic corruption at every level in those societies. Hello, I am Paul Butler. Welcome to Wisdom Tuesday. This presentation is designed to add value to your life. I want to address tonight why countries are stagnant in economic growth. Now, economic growth is measured by an increase in gross domestic product. We call it the GDP, which is defined as the combined value of all goods and services produced within a country in a year. Many forces contribute to economic growth. However, there is no single factor that consistently spurs the perfect or ideal amount of growth needed for an economy. To have a greater appreciation for economic growth versus stagnant growth in an economy, I want to present some of the core benefits for growth. And then I will present the other side when growth is sluggish. It's important to have the differentiation. Now, importance of economic growth. Economic growth means a rise in the real GDP. Effectively, this means a rise in national income, national output, and total expenditure. Economic growth should enable a rise in the living standards and a greater consumption of goods and services. And as a result, economic growth is often seen as the sacred grail of microeconomics. And when we say micro, we're talking about large in quantity. We're talking about the whole scope of the economy. Economic growth will increase employment, which causes the fall in unemployment. There will be an increase in tax revenue that enables governments to increase spending on public services. Growth will increase consumption that will certainly encourage local and foreign investment. Now, as we look at economic growth and how it can help various microeconomic objectives, this is how you accomplish something. Reduction in poverty. This means increased national output that households can enjoy more goods and services. Every citizen of the country is looking for this. For countries with significant levels of poverty, economic growth can vastly improve living standards. Secondly, reduce unemployment. We're talking about economic growth that can help various microeconomic objectives. So number 2 is reduce unemployment. A stagnant economy leads to higher rates of unemployment. And the consequence is social misery. So the fight for survival creates and increases many social problems in many countries. That's why economic growth is important, because it leads to higher demand and companies are likely to increase employment. And then thirdly, improve public services. Higher economic growth leads to higher tax revenues, even with tax rates staying the same. With higher growth, income and profits, the government will receive more income tax, corporate tax, and expenditure taxes. As a result, a government then can spend more on public services. Another one is reduce debt to the GDP ratios. Reduce debt to the GDP ratios. Certainly, economic growth helps reduce the debt to the GDP ratios. In the 1950s, the UK had a national debt of 200% of the GDP. Despite very few years of budget surplus, so economic growth, reduction in levels of debt to the GDP. Now that's amazing. But now in this present economic woes that they're experiencing, there are so many variations and explanations that even economists are confused. But let me look at the core reason for this presentation tonight. Why countries are stagnant in economic growth. We're not talking about one particular country, but we are talking about all those different countries who are struggling economically, in spite of all the vast natural resources they have. Some countries are small and they're struggling, and some countries are very large and they're struggling. But let's look at some of these core principles that determines why there's stagnant economic growth. Number one, poor leadership. And when I say poor leadership, I'm not just talking about a president or prime minister only, but the entire leadership, the core people who come together and say, this is the vision and this is how we're going to move this country from A to B. So poor leadership, let me say this, there will be human capital waste. Anytime there's failed leadership, human capital is wasted. Social problems will continue to rise, and little or no growth will happen economically. Also with poor leadership, progressive leadership, well, let me put it this way, progressive leadership in any country starts with self-leadership. And what do I mean? There must be self-governance to avoid moral failures and public disgrace. Without developing a system of ethics and values, which they must adhere to, failure and corruption is inevitable. Governments and other country leaders must understand this fundamental truth. We cannot get away from it. That leadership involves three basic things: people, problems, and power. People, problems, and power. First, empathy must be shown by their government towards their citizen plight to survive. Secondly, problems. Government must solve problems. That's the reason why they were elected and they appoint leadership positions. And thirdly, power. Power is given to drive economic development and growth, not to abuse, but to cause development and growth. And when we think about poor leadership, every government should be guided by a national vision that far exceeds their election term period to serve, whether that's 4 years or 5 years. The roadmap must be clear. All of the country should know the direction the nation is headed. And that is a major problem, and especially in many third world countries. They don't have a clue where the government is going with their economy. For example, building infrastructure for transportation and utilities, developing human capital, state the type of foreign investment needed or what kind of investors they are targeting. What incentive will be given to citizens to create jobs, or the plans to expand existing industries, and the new initiatives for diversification of the economy. Citizens should know where the government is taking their country. When the average citizen doesn't know these things, you know there is failing leadership at work in your country. If you assess poor countries, you would find many of the same problems that are stifling economic growth and development. Here is a major factor impacting livelihood that needs to be analyzed so as for leaders to develop a national vision to bring about national transformation. Let's start even with the mind. There's something called psychological behavior. What is the mindset of the citizens of any poor country? Is it that the government should make all the changes to improve the quality of their lives? Many citizens think that way. Or on the other hand, should the people be willing to become socially responsible, hardworking, and full of acceptance for the rule of law and order? Or is that too big of a sacrifice for its citizens? If you want dramatic changes, everybody got to pay a price. And I may add also, what people believe and value will determine their behavior. For instance, if a person has a mindset, who you elect as government doesn't matter. Many countries I have been to, that's the mindset of many of their citizens. That it doesn't matter what government you elect, they really don't see any difference. Some people believe that way. Another way of thinking is, every man is for himself and God is for us all. Now this may sound pathetic, but reality for some segment of the population subscribe to that kind of rationale. And then there's something I notice among many poor nations that are struggling economically, is the religious component, which is huge in poor countries. They are super religious. There are so many gods and superstitions, and those who have no belief system about a supernatural deity. The truth is, what people believe about God can influence or form their moral conduct as their standard for living. Also, in the religious component, there is belief that life cannot get any better on earth for them due to the fact that there's so much lack and so much suffering. And so their focus is to prepare for eternity. So they make life totally about spirituality and not trying to learn principles and how to get themselves out of their dilemma. It's a sad reality, but it does exist in many countries that are struggling economically. However, I believe there is so much turmoil about religion simply because demonic spirits have attached themselves behind anything that people worship outside of the true and living God. Spiritual blindness is how people all over the world are deceived and fallen into spiritual captivity. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4 says this. This is from the Holy Bible. In whom the God of this world had blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. And so wherever there's spiritual blindness, you're going to see a lot of darkness, human trafficking, drugs, prostitution, homosexuality, and you just name it. Every form of moral degradation you will see where there's spiritual blindness. So in light of principles and even good governance, there is always a spiritual component how the citizens of a country view God. And as we know, you can take several major countries, they have thousands of different religions or different gods that they worship or serve. And it's sad, but it is an existing reality for centuries. And in St. John's Gospel, chapter 8, verse 32, Jesus spoke these words, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth will make you free." That's one thing about the power of the gospel. When people embrace the truth of what Christ has done on the cross, it is so liberating. Anything to do with economics, business, marriage, health, you just think about it. It's in the Word of God. All of human solutions is in the Word of God. Even how leaders must conduct themselves. So we are addressing poor leadership. That is one of the core reasons why many countries are stagnant in economic growth. I want to caution you as you listen to this. Whatever you are a citizen of any country that is struggling economically, you should demand this from the citizenry. No nation leader should call an election without leaders from all representing parties debating the national issues of concern. We don't need just political rallies. We need the meat. Where are they going to take the country? Because it is easy to get caught up in the hype and still not know for sure where your country is going. And that is so common in third world nations or in nations where there's great economic struggle. Voters must know the thinking and the plans that will produce a better quality of life from them, who they are going to elect. You don't elect people and just hope things work out. And also those who are elected, what opportunities they would create for personal advancement. They want to know that there is a new hope and a better future for the country. Let me say this, that fair leadership is one of the reasons why countries are stagnant in economic growth. Everything starts with leadership. There's a common saying that everything rises and falls on leadership. Number two, as we talk about stagnant in economic growth, why countries are going through that. Meritocracy, sound like a big word, but it simply means it is an elite group of people who progress is based on ability and talent rather on class, privilege, or wealth. Without the implementation of this system, meritocracy, unqualified people like family members, party supporters, and financial contributors to the governing party will hold positions they are not qualified for. And that happens in most poor countries. By not implementing this system of meritocracy, many unqualified business people, contractors, etc., will get contracts and produce poor quality of work and services with taxpayers' money. That's a sad reality. That's how government wastes a lot of money. This is a reality in all struggling economies, especially third world nations. A country wouldn't grow economically as long as these type of practices continue. We must realize this adds to government's waste in spending. It is difficult to motivate the morale of your nation's workforce with those kinds of practices. You would find in the public service or the civil service in government, in many third world countries, a qualified worker may not get a position they earned the right to because it may not be publicly known that that civil servant is not subscribing to the governing party. Oh, it's so sad. In many countries, they don't understand service excellence. As a result, many countries never get out of their poverty. The conditions remains the same regardless of successive or different governments being elected. It's not always that parties don't have a great plan, but all the things that are sucking the life of the country continues. Any country serious about economic growth must address these concerns. It must be a matter of priority, because it doesn't matter how great a vision an administration will have, it will not come into fruition if meritocracy is not adopted as a system so the country could progress. You want the best mind, you want the best personnel operating and causing the country to move forward. You know, in Proverbs chapter 18, verse 9, it says, "He also that is slothful in his work is a brother to him that is a great waster." That's the truth. And then in chapter 18, verse 25, it says, "The desire of the slothful killeth him, for his hands refuse to labor." But in every poor country, in every third world country, those two verses of scripture apply. And it greatly impacts government progressing economically, because you have so many wasters of time and people who are not qualified to do jobs they have been appointed to. But let's look at number 3. Why countries are stagnant in economic growth. Number 3, accountability and analysis. Now, how can a nation progress economically with the lack of accountability and no analysis why the country is so challenged? Growth will continue to be slow, and the future would not be bright if those two components are not put into effect. There has to be accountability. Now, I know third world nation, that's a common saying by almost every government that is elected to power. We will have accountability and transparency. And give them less than 6 months, so many things you don't know what they're doing behind the scene. That's why certain laws they wouldn't pass, so the public will know all their operations. Some things, they say that, and it feels good, and they hope that the public will forget what they said on their campaign. You know, all government leaders and public servants or civil servants should be held to the highest standards. In third world nation, how many government ministries or departments you can call and will never get an answer? Nobody picks up the phone, but you'll never see that in the private sector. Why? Because the private sector is in business to make a profit. So the mindset in government needs to change. Not just the elected party officials, but at every level in government. So in many respects, their service quality would be better if we adopt what is happening in the private sector. Abuse in struggling countries cannot change their destiny unless there is true accountability and analysis of the good and the bad. Governments must be serious in imposing penalty when abuse is being practiced, and it is happening all over the world. Voters must also hold elected officials accountable where any forms of corruption or abuse is known in blatant, and also, I may add this matter too, blatant immorality. There should be a code of ethics established in the public domain, especially for elected officials. Now, if an elected official is not a Christian, we don't expect for them to be a standard bearer when it comes to morality. But however, decency should still be required of them. Number 4, as we look at some of the core reasons why many countries are stagnant in economic growth. Skilled workforce. Some countries, I mean, for decade after decade after decade, they still have an unskilled workforce. But what in the world those governments have been doing? No country can sustain economic viability if they do not invest in building human capital. Many tourist-based economies continue to suffer, and never get the full benefits of major foreign investment projects in their country. And these fragile economies must be intentional in developing skilled carpenters and masons and electricians and plumbers, tile layers, welders, etc. If you're going to build internally, a skilled workforce is paramount. And this has to be a part of the educational process, even from high school. There should be many vocational schools that will train the workforce. This is something that cannot be taken lightly, because every time something good happens in many third world nations, they have to import a whole lot of foreign workers. And in fact, some projects are so large, you can clean up most of all the unemployment. Most third world nations have enough lawyers. So we need more skilled people. And because lawyers primarily, not all of them, but many of them, they don't understand nothing about business. They know how to interpret the law. Let me add this. No country who is serious about economic growth, who doesn't heavily invest in agriculture, is not serious about independence. It should be the goal of every nation who want to feed themselves the best way they can. All nations who are almost dependent on other nations to feed them, especially when they possess the ability to reduce imports of foods considerably. This is mind-boggling, that after independence for 60 years, 40 years, 30 years, and there has been no change in feeding your people. So skilled workforce is needed to build and to grow an economy. Without creativity, innovation, diversification of the economy, proper work ethics, a nation cannot get its preferred destination. It cannot get there. And in raising the standards of living for their people. And then number 5, as we talk why countries are stagnant in economic growth and development. Number 5, enforcement of laws and regulations. Many things are written, but they are not enforced. There's vandalism. Some countries you go to is filthy. It's just a sad reality. Why? Because laws are not enforced. Reckless driving on the streets. Young men lifting motorcycles on one wheel with no helmets. And every time you hear we're going to have zero tolerance against crime, and it keeps going up year after year. Nothing is more vexing for a law-abiding citizen to see disorder and the lack of enforcement of the laws. Countries who don't deal with crime severely drain their resources with a large police force, building more prisons, and then an overload on their judicial system. And in addition to that, it terrorizes their countrymen and visitors alike not to be victims of crime. So if laws are not enforced, we can't just concentrate on economics because they go hand in hand. All governments should have a heavy flow of revenue coming in from citizens and residents who act in an irresponsible manner. I look in my own country, just traffic violations could bring in a substantial amount of revenue. Even for the not serious crimes, people will go on the beach and have a picnic, fine. And then do what? Leave their dirt right there. That should be a fine for $500. They should have cameras monitoring that. So when people do things, a police don't physically even, or a warden to walk up to them, they'll just get the ticket. This is why the environment must remain clean and pristine. Traffic fatality will dramatically be reduced when laws are enforced and there's order. People can live without fear. Through enforcement of the laws and regulations, can civility to society be restored. No country can truly progress economically and have civility unless you have quality leadership, a system of meritocracy, a skilled workforce, and enforcement of laws and regulations. Now let me end with this. Here's a passage of scripture taken from Lamentations chapter 5. And I believe it is relevant to most third world countries or those countries that are struggling economically. Because I believe there's a spiritual dimension why countries prosper. Now, I know there are some countries in the world that religion is not even in their mindset. But one thing you would have to notice about those countries that are prospering, that is not super religious, is that they still have a moral code that govern their governments. And there is accountability. So a lot of things that are in poor nation where there's a lot of religion, it's not serving any great purpose. But listen what it says in Lamentation chapter 5. And those of you watching, if you are in a third world nation, you will come to realize that this is an accurate description of what's going on in your country. Beginning at verse 1, Lord, remember what has happened to us. See how we have been disgraced. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. We are orphans and fatherless. Our mothers are widowed. We have to pay for water to drink, or even firewood is expensive. Those who pursue us are at our heels. We are exhausted, but we are given no rest. So submitted to the Egyptians, and we're talking about hedonistic nations, and the Assyrians to get enough food to survive. Isn't that a reality? Our ancestors sinned, but they have died, and we are suffering the punishment they deserve. Slaves are now become our masters. There is no one left to rescue us. We hunt for food at the risk of our lives. For violence rules the countrysides. The famine has blackened our skin as though baked in an oven. Our enemies rape the women in Jerusalem or in our countries, and our young girls are in all the towns of Judah. Our princes have been hung by their thumbs, and our elders are treated with contempt, no respect. Young men are led away to work at millstones, and the boys staggered under a heavy load of wood. The elders no longer sit in the city gates. The young men no longer dance and sing. They don't have no joy, because joy has left our hearts. The garlands have fallen from our heads. In other words, our crown. We have lost our dignity. Weep for us because we have sinned. Our hearts are sick and weary. Our eyes grow dim with tears. For Jerusalem is empty and desolate, and a place haunted by jackals. But the Lord, you remain the same forever. Your throne continues from generation to generations. Why do you continue to forget us? Why have you abandoned us for so long? Restore us, O Lord, and bring us back to you again. Get us back the joy we once had. Or have you utterly rejected us? Are you angry with us still? It is important to all of my viewing audience. God does play an important role, particularly in countries that say Christianity is their main religion. I know even in my country, in the preambles, it says something to this effect, that we will be guided by Christian values. That's why we must watch our legislators closely, that they don't pass any laws that offends the heart of God. This is important, but I believe the church has a major role to play in bringing restoration to a nation. It bringing dignity back. And I believe with godly wisdom, any struggling nation economically can move forward. I believe that the model has already been set. And I believe many of our third world countries can get out of their pit. And especially those countries that have small population, like under 2 million. There can be dramatic changes in one term of any elected government. And now that we have been faced with the world famines of the locusts in Asia and many of the African countries, and there are other regions of the world. And then on the eve of that comes this global pandemic of the coronavirus. So all impacted. And so what we have heard tonight isn't something to be taken lightly. And I trust that value has been added to your thinking when it comes to economic development and economic growth. And so I want to thank you for giving us your time tonight. Wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom. But in all you're getting, get understanding. God bless you and stay safe.